Hi, Kevin Tharp here. Today we're going to be talking about page layout with CSS. And before we can get into doing that, there's things that you need to understand about the web. For instance, the document object model. That is a description of the way that objects on a page are laid out, the way that they nest within each other. The document object model. And the key word in there is object, because elements in a page are all objects. Anything that can be inside of a web page is an object, and there are different things that you can do to that. And so what we need to understand is that in any document there is a document object model, which is the layout of how the different objects in the page interact with each other and nest within each other. And so in the example here that we're looking at, if I had an encyclopedia that had two and only two sections in it, science and culture, then this is what the beginning of that document object would look like. In this situation, encyclopedia is the parent object and all of the other objects sit within it. Below that sits science and culture. Now that is called a parent-child relationship, where the encyclopedia is the parent and both science and culture are the children objects of that. At the same time, since they're both children of the same parents, that makes science and culture siblings. So they're at the same location or the same level in the document object model. So now if within culture we had two more sections, one on art and one on craft, then both of those would sit within culture and they would both be children of culture. And so to take this out, art would not have a direct relationship with science, and craft would not have a direct relationship with science. And so in that document object model, it's going to end up something like this, where let's just take it from the perspective of culture. Culture is a parent object to both art and craft. It is a sibling to science, and it is a child of encyclopedia. So that is the document object model, and you need to understand that any object must sit completely within the object that it is a child of. So we couldn't set it up so that we have craft sitting half in and half out of the culture. It has to sit completely within it, and that is a standard practice of coding. At least it is on the web. So that's the document object model, and we'll get into it more in a little bit. So when we are working with the web, there are certain properties that any object can have, and this is called the box model. The box model is a description of the properties that can apply to any object that are included in a web page, and in the center of that box you will see the actual content. So whether it be an image or a header level 1 or a paragraph or a div or any of the elements that can be in a web page, in the center of that is going to be the content. And then outside of the content is a section for padding. And what the padding does is it separates the content inside of that object from the border of that object. So it establishes a space between the content and the border, whether you can see the border or not. Which brings us to the third section, which is the border. And the border is a section that can be visible. It basically forms the outside edge of the box model, and it sits on the outside of the paddings, and so that the content has the padding between the border and the content. And so the border, if you make it visible, is exactly that. It's a visible border, and there are three different properties to that. You have to do width, style, and color in order to actually be able to see that border. If you don't have all three of those properties, then it's not a visual border, but it is still there. Now the margin is a transparent element on the outside, the very outside of the box. And what that does is that separates this object from any other object. So the margin is going to create, just as the padding creates a space between the border and the content, the margin creates a border or a padding, a space between the border or the object itself and any other elements, so that they don't bust up into each other. So if we want to explore this, we'll come to a page looking at the Stout Web Tech page on Facebook, and what we do is if you want to view the document object model, what you need to do is you need to turn off all the style information. And so I personally prefer to use Firefox when I'm doing this, because it provides us with a set of tools that are useful for us to explore the different information. And so what I want to do is, in order to show you the normal flow of content on this page, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to disable all the styles. And what that's going to do is it is going to show us what the actual content of the page is, but it's also going to show us the normal flow of that information. So with the styles applied, all of this information gets laid out in different places on the page, and without those styles, then you're able to see the actual the normal flow of that information. So I'm going to turn it back on, and you'll notice that it spreads out through the page, and it's not displayed necessarily in the order that it sits in the normal flow of the document. So that's an important thing to understand, is that there is the normal flow, which is the way that it is coded into the HTML, and then there are rules that allow you to take information out of the normal flow, and that's one of the things that we need to understand when we start talking about positioning and padding or floating.